Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good Friday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 21st of August. As always, we advise you and encourage you to stay up to date on your local weather information. No matter what part of Alaska you're in, we have a weather forecast for you, and in the case of bad weather, we'll let you know that it's coming and tell you that way in warnings or advisories, or give you even longer heads up with a watch. And some of those things may develop as we head over the weekend into southeastern Alaska. Nothing out right now, but always a good time to stay up on what's going on in your community by going to weather.gov/Alaska. The weather info line is open at 800-472-0391. You can find information out about your weather on Facebook at NWS Alaska, on Twitter using the hashtag AKwx, and on YouTube, your daily afternoon map briefing there, right around 3:45 to about 4 o'clock. Let's talk about total rainfall through Sunday night in southeastern Alaska. There is a deepening storm out in the central Gulf, and on the northern side, showers, thunderstorms, and periods of heavy rain. That is shifting eastward and strengthening, and as it does so, it's latching on to some very deep Pacific moisture. By the end of Sunday night, there's a potential that areas west of Cross Sound could be looking at 5 to 7 inches of rainfall, again, by Sunday night. So this is going to be several days worth of rainfall. Areas around Sitka could be looking at about 3 to 4, even 5 inches of rainfall in some cases, and the same goes for areas around the Juneau region and the Mendenhall Lake and the Mendenhall River, of course, with concerns there around the glacial dam release. That could bring those levels up even higher as we go into the weekend. The wind gust forecast is also of concern because soils are saturated. Heavy rainfall will be an issue, so the potential for a slight chance of a mudslide is certainly greater than if none of those things were happening. The wind gusts show here, at least on these certain points, anywhere from about 35 to 40 miles per hour. Yesterday we were talking about wind gusts that could go as strong as 45 miles per hour in some cases, so that certainly is a potential, especially through some of the inner waterways there. And you can see the gusts, they're right along the coast at their maximum level, probably on the order of 40 to 49 miles per hour. So again, watching for that to pick up as we go into Saturday and Saturday night, as low pressure will be at its lowest point there across the central Gulf. What about the waves with this? Well, as we get into Saturday and Sunday, the highest waves will be offshore. We're not expecting any great surge to go through the inner channels there, but watch for the seas to come up to about 15 to as high as about 20 feet there. Most of that will be from Sitka southward, and you'll see that in the marine weather forecast when we get a little bit finer detail for you coming up toward the end of the show. So things changing for southeastern Alaska after kind of a dry break today. The weather will be changing as we head through tonight and into tomorrow, with periods of moderate to heavy rain for central and northern parts of southeast, especially as we go through the daytime tomorrow. So be on your guard. And again, if you're near one of those places that floods, now's a great time to review how you're going to deal with changes or warnings if they're issued from your National Weather Service office in Juneau. Always a good time to make sure Marine VHF is coming in just fine, as well as your NOAA weather radio. Here's a look at the Bering Sea and the northern Pacific, and this kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, doesn't it? That would be Typhoon Atsani, and we've been wondering, where is Atsani going in the next week or so? There's concerns a while ago that maybe this typhoon would recurve and head back into the Bering, or at least very close to the Aleutians. The interesting news today is it doesn't look like that's a huge concern anymore. A lot of the forecast models are now kind of keeping that out across the north and western Pacific. We're still going to need to watch the moisture. The moisture leaving tropical systems, including typhoons, is certainly something that feeds into our weather pattern, especially for the southern half of Alaska this time of the year. It's feeding into Juneau's weather pattern over the weekend. So we're not really completely removed from any threat from Atsani. However, the actual low pressure center that is left over from Atsani at the end of the day, whether that's this week or next, at least as of today, doesn't look like it's going to steer its way up toward the Aleutians. Tomorrow, maybe a butterfly flaps its wings and we'll see what happens. So that's still a ways away from being any major issue. In the meantime, what's happening now is low pressure sitting south of Shemya. This is traveling eastward and pulling in more moisture from the Pacific. You can see the trail of moisture that's feeding into the low pressure system deepening over the Gulf of Alaska. So let's take a look at that. Here we go, and you can see this system working its way into the central Gulf today. All this very bright white cloud cover. It's a little unusual for the Gulf. Those were thunderstorms, and for a good part of the day we had thunder and lightning over western parts of Prince William Sound and the western Gulf of Alaska, very near Seward. And then by the very late end of the day, we had a shower thunderstorm pop up very close to Kenai over the Cook Inlet. We also had some developing convective weather across the Alaska Range, a few strikes there right along the western Alaska Range. And this center will probably allow those showers and thunderstorms to diminish as we go through the late afternoon, and then probably reform a little bit closer to the storm's center here, right over the Gulf. So all of this energy is working its way eastward, and again, is going to focus some heavy rain and probably some coastal thunderstorms. Most of that will be offshore, but if you're heading out to sea tomorrow, even in the rough weather, plan for the opportunity for some thunderstorms there along some of the coastal marine zones. So pretty active storm, pretty vigorous storm, considering, again, this is over the Gulf of Alaska. Now, South Central, you're still dealing with clouds. Not a whole lot of rainfall in the forecast. One exception is going to be the Copper River Basin. There's plenty of moisture. It looks like it's going to be heading toward the Copper River Basin as we go into this weekend. Northward, a lot of cloud cover heading north and a lot of unsettled weather for the west as well. It will not be a dry weekend for many across the central and western parts of the interior. For the Bering Sea, high pressure is trying to settle in, and you can see the stratus and the fog for many places out there. Let's take a look at the surface chart. Here's low pressure at 1,001 millibars. Rain and thunder again across the northern parts of the Gulf today and across the western Alaska Range. Areas of stable air across the North Slope. A few pockets of fog there, especially east of Point Barrow, and warmer air spreading northward up toward the southeast coast after a break in the weather today. High pressure sitting across the central chains at 1,035 millibars. That's going to drop a little bit further south and weaken tonight as low pressure strengthens and kind of absorbs some of that. A 990 millibar low developing with showers and thunderstorms across coastal areas for southeast and across the northern Gulf. And most likely centering of those storms will be on the northern side of that low pressure system as we head into tonight. Pockets of rainfall across the interior. Looks like more clouds than anything else for south central and coastal areas of western Alaska, including Norton Sound, and areas around Kotzebue Sound will be a little bit closer to a northern wave of low pressure there at 1,014 millibars. That could have some rain with it as well. That continues eastward as we head into Saturday. Look for some showers and thunderstorms, convective weather here across the upper Yukon Valley and toward Arctic Village and points east. Meanwhile, low pressure drops to 992 millibars across the central and eastern Gulf now. Again, an opportunity for thunderstorms near coastal marine zones there for south and east. The front will have moved in, but the onshore flow will be pretty strong, and that means moderate to heavy rainfall will be a part of your day in central and northern parts of southeast, and occasional rainfall across southern parts of southeast. Meanwhile, a drier day for south central and maybe a few less clouds for the Kenai Peninsula and the Cook Inlet region as well as Kodiak Island. Wouldn't be surprised to see some stronger gap winds around places like False Pass and the Alaska Peninsula. Look for the frontal boundary across the interior to swing eastward of the Yukon Valley and head toward the interior. That means a better chance of showers for places like Fairbanks. Warmer air is traveling up through eastern Asia on the northern side of high pressure. As we get into Sunday, that travels even further inland toward western Alaska and through the Kotzebue Sound region. That should bring some more rainfall through the western coast. Showers across the North Slope. Drier weather develops across the central interior and southward. There still could be some breezy, if not blustery conditions for the Alaska Peninsula as a result of that. And low pressure starts to fill in across the eastern Gulf to 1,006 millibars. However, we're still looking at that onshore flow with plenty of deep moisture out ahead of it and support in the upper atmosphere around the jet stream level and below for the storm to stay right in place. And because of that, and because of the moisture wrapped up and the dynamics or the changes in temperature from top to bottom, we have support for more rain, more clouds, and maybe even some thunder and lightning in the region. And that promotes a better chance for moderate to heavy rainfall to continue on Sunday. Thus, those higher rainfall amounts that we saw just a few minutes ago. High pressure just south of the central Aleutians at 1,034 millibars is tightening up the flow out to the west. That means a little bit more breezy conditions for places like Kiska and Attu, and a chance for rainfall to start building in out toward the west as systems begin to head northward into the Bering there. Temperature-wise today, with a little bit of sunshine in southeast, Sitka, and places like Juneau, all in the 50s and 60s today. Not a bad day at all for Ketchikan and Annette and Hyder at 64. Yakutat was 61, about the same in Cordova. 54 in Valdez, 50s for Seward and Homer today, with 60 in Anchorage, 64 in Talkeetna. Healy was 58, Fort Greely was 62, Fairbanks 63, Eagle 66, Northway 61, Golcana 58. Lower 60s for Fort Yukon, lower 50s for AKwx Pass, and we saw upper 30s from Barrow. A little bit warmer down the road in AKwx with mid 40s for Wainwright down toward Point Hope and Point Lake. AKwx was 37 degrees. Kotzebue Sound in the 40s and 50s. Nome showed 52. Unalakleet 53. McGrath 63 degrees and 57 in Galena. 50s and 60s for Southwest Alaska, including 67 in King Salmon today with Lake Iliamna at 63. 10 degrees cooler in St. George, 1 degree warmer than that in St. Paul, and 63 in Kodiak, with upper 50s and lower 60s for most of the Alaska Peninsula, most areas in the 50s in fact. For the central chain, low 50s did the trick today. Atka was 55 and Shemya showing 51 degrees this afternoon. Overnight low temperatures in southwest will hover pretty close to 50 degrees from Bethel all the way down toward the Bristol Bay region. About the same there for the Alaska Peninsula. A little bit cooler for Adak and Atka. Southeast in the low to mid 50s for most stations there. Prince William Sound in the mid 40s. The Middle Tanana Valley will hover in the upper 40s, but cooler for Eagle and Northway. The North Slope and north of the Brooks Range should see temperatures at least in the 30s. A few places a little bit higher up might hold in the 40s, like Arctic Village, and 43 for Nome. High temperatures tomorrow will be the warmest around Fort Yukon, at least for interior locations. 60 for Fairbanks, South Central in the upper 60s with sunshine and drier winds coming off the mountains. Upper 50s to about 60 degrees for southeast with plenty of rain, warm winds, and certainly looking at some breezy conditions. 64 in Kodiak, upper 50s and lower 60s for southwestern Alaska, including the YK Delta. Nome, you're looking at temperatures close to 50 tomorrow. Kotzebue Sound just below the 50-degree mark, and Barrow expect a high of 38 with low 50s for most of the Aleutians, the Alaska Peninsula, and the Pribilofs. Flying weather shows IFR conditions will continue for a large part of the Beaufort Seacoast, especially in the morning, and through the Bering Strait and most of the western coast, but most areas will see some improvements as the day goes on toward MBFR conditions. That includes what you see in the interior. For southeast, expect IFR conditions to wane for Chilkoot and White Pass as we go through the day, and probably worsen for some areas in the south with MBFR surrounding the low pressure system in the Gulf. AKwx Pass, we expect to see MBFR though for most of the day. A shower or thunderstorm shouldn't be ruled out for Adigan Pass either, also looking at MBFR. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass will likely see improvements as we go through your day. Rainy Pass heading for MBFR. Looks like Windy Pass should see visual flight rule by the end of Saturday. Isabel Pass also starting out a little bit on the poor side, but improvements are noted there, and for Mentasta Pass on Saturday. Tanita Pass, we expect to see visual flight rule. Portage Pass looking for VFR, and Chilkoot and White Pass starting out at IFR and maybe getting a little bit better for MBFR by the afternoon. Freezing levels show colder air is dropping southward again over the Seward Peninsula, with levels there and over Norton Sound down to 4,000 feet, 2,000 feet across the Chukchi Seacoast. However, they're responding upwards as you look out toward the southern Bering, anywhere from 12 to 14,000 feet over Kodiak Island, about 7,000 feet, 6,000 to 8,000 feet across southeast Alaska. And this cool pool of air here is part of the reason why the storm is so energetic out over the Gulf. Above 10,000 feet, you'll have to get pretty far up there to run into icing potential, unless you get close to a thunderstorm, of course, which implies isolated but severe icing threats. There will be some opportunities for occasional moderate, though, if you're flying high. And above 7,000 feet and north of the Brooks Range, watch for light to isolated moderate there, generally west of Arctic Village and over AKwx Pass to Point Barrow. The jet stream shows that upper level support. The low pressure center is pretty much right on top of the surface storm, and that really makes a very good system to keep that storm very energetic out over the open water. High pressure is pushing that warmer and wetter air out across the western Aleutians, and that has a direct line all the way down to that subtropical moisture and those typhoons that we were looking at just a little while ago. The cooler air is having a little trouble dropping really far south, and this storm out over the Gulf really isn't tapping into that yet. If this were a couple of months later, of course, it would be a very different story. Low pressure across the north and eastern Gulf at 9,000 feet shows winds coming into the backside of that at 30 to 40 knots. South and westerlies are coming into the Dixon entrance about 25 to 40 knots, and winds over southeastern Alaska, including Juneau, could reach as high as 40 knots at the 9,000 foot level. Wind speeds from the north and west over the Alaska Peninsula and the central chain really not slowing down that much, about 20 to about 35 knots or so, and light winds across the north slope still coming in at a northerly direction at 3,000 feet. Low pressure is pretty much in the same spot at 3,000 feet. Winds are a little different, still coming in from the north and west at about 25 to 35 knots. They're a little bit stronger on the south side in this case, up to 50 knots, and south and southeasterly winds over southeastern Alaska at 22, 25 knots there. High pressure still in charge of the Bering with winds around it at 25 to 40 knots, much stronger on the western side. And the northwest coast looking at winds from 15 to 30 knots. So we should expect some turbulence. In fact, I was hesitant not to draw in some isolated severe, but there probably will be tomorrow. So pay attention. If you've got any flying plans this weekend, you need to pay attention to the turbulence reports. And if you are flying, please issue some PIREPs. That would be very helpful to your pilot community. Below 4,000 feet looks to be the best chance for occasional moderate around the southeastern coast, especially along the outer coast. And then watch for gap winds and some low-level wind shear across the Alaska Peninsula, especially below 4,000 feet south of Kodiak Island, and then a developing area of turbulence in the west for the western chain below 3,000 feet. That's a look at your aviation weather and more. We'll be back with your marine weather and the sea ice edge here in just a few minutes. Stay tuned.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Mary O'Connor with the Alaskan Aviation Safety Foundation and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. On behalf of Alaska Public Media, thank you for watching Hangar Flying. This evening, we are happy to have back on our show Bill Compton. Bill is an accomplished pilot with over 10,000 hours and has an airline transport pilot and flight instructor certificate. He owns a turbocharged V-tail Bonanza, which he's flown all over Alaska and the world. He's also a published author and has an article in our latest newsletter from the Alaskan Aviation Safety Foundation. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Well, thank you, Mary.
So we were chatting about an accident that took place in southeast Alaska in August of 2008. And we determined that the pilot had been flying all day with multiple stops from the lower 48. And he got into a situation where had he recognized that he had been fatigued, it could have been prevented. So before we talk about fatigue, maybe let's talk a little bit about flight planning and having an option for an alternate or a plan B.
Well, part of every instrument flight plan includes the destination and the alternate. There are exceptions to requiring an alternate, but flying the Alaska coast and British Columbia coast, since the airports are so far apart, it really is wise to always have an alternate.
And for a plan B, there's always an option to stay with the airplane. The pilot took off just before sunset, so things were getting late in the day. He had been in the airplane for a long time. It was getting dark. There was nothing preventing him from sleeping in the airplane, uncomfortable as that may have been, or even staying overnight in the town.
Certainly. He and his passenger were elderly folks. He was 82 and his friend was a little bit older, but they could have walked into town. And their bed and breakfasts in Gustavus. They could have taken off and flown to Juneau. They could have gotten briefed on a communications outlet at Gustavus. He could have been briefed and had a better plan. Could have had some advice from the flight service specialist. So he missed doing all those things. And I think all of that points back to fatigue.
You mentioned in another article that's likely going to be published soon that every flight should be approached with a willingness to cancel in the face of newfound risks, no matter the inconvenience, expense, or embarrassment. Can you expand about this? I think it's great advice.
Well, my expansion of that is that pilots need to have the courage to be a chicken. Let yourself be embarrassed. This is too much for me. I'm not going to do it. The hair is standing back up on the back of my head, and that's a sign to me that I should not hit the starter button on this airplane.
So pilots should listen to what their senses are telling them. My flight instructor used to say, always have an out, but you put it much more elegantly. But there really is no reason. If for whatever feeling pilots have, whether they're starting to notice symptoms of fatigue, whether they are just getting tired of sitting in an airplane, there's no reason not to cancel that flight and stay put.
Yes.
In our next show, we're going to talk about some of the symptoms of fatigue that you have experienced and how you've mitigated some of those. Can you tell us how you got to experience some of these symptoms?
Oh, well, I've had a bunch of flights that included sunset and sun up the next morning. And flying between 2 a.m. and sunrise, sleep is just about overwhelming. And on a solo flight, it's with the knowledge that if one goes to sleep, one is dead. And even with a co-pilot, you might be safe enough to sleep, but I find it's impossible for me to sleep in an airplane because it's just not comfortable, and there's always something to worry about.
And if it's not the sunrise, sunset, altitude also can play a part, correct?
Oh, absolutely. You know, at sea level, normally, if we have normal cardiovascular system, the saturation of our blood with oxygen is 99 to 100%. But up at 10,000 feet, which is a common altitude flown for distances, most would have a saturation of 88 to 92%. Not okay.
Thank you so much. We're going to get back into this on our next show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure, Mary. Thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you're not a member of the Alaskan Aviation Safety Foundation but would like to learn more about the accident we've been discussing, please send us an email at aasfonline@gmail.com. We'll make sure you get a copy of the article. Until next time, fly safely.
Thank you. See you again on Monday. Here's a look at today's Sea Ice Edge from our sea ice analysts at the Anchorage Weather Service office. Weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php is the place to go for this. It's still kind of a tricky maneuver getting through some of the ice and very close to the mud flats there north of Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse. But you can see there is just a thin sliver of open water with concentrations probably a little bit lower than 40 to 50% there in the open areas. And you can see the ice pack itself is still fairly close to shore. There are many areas of open water there east of Barrow and west of Kaktovik, but this is proving to be the challenge point there around Prudhoe Bay to Dead Horse and then westward. You can always see the latest forecasts and updates there out for the next 5 days at the webpage provided there. Saturday's forecast in southeast going to be windy. Could be stormy along the coastal areas as well starting tonight. Look for winds to come up from the south and southwest, 30 to 35 knots with 40 knot winds from the east around Yakutat. So gales going there, 15-foot seas to 17-foot seas down toward the Cross Sound entrance and then down toward 16 to 18-foot seas as you head southward down the coast. 25-knot winds there on the inside. They're not expecting thunderstorms so much on the inside, but as we get into Sunday, winds come in from the west and southwest, diminishing in most areas 15 to 35 knots with south and southeasterlies from 20 to 30 knots, seas 4 to 6 foot on the inside there for Sunday. As we get into south central, look for northwesterlies in most areas. Gales going just east of the Barrens, 40 knots with a 12-foot sea. Northwesterlies inside of Prince William Sound with a 3-foot sea, 4-foot seas in the northern parts of Cook Inlet. For Sunday, northwesterlies are still going, but diminishing in most areas. 10-knot winds across the Cook Inlet to Prince William Sound, 35 knots east of the Barrens and east of Kodiak Island with a 10-foot sea in the western Gulf, 7-foot seas in the north. and much drier conditions for many heading eastward into the Gulf. As you look at the Alaska Peninsula, northwesterlies inside of Bristol Bay, 25 knots there, and south of Sandpoint and King Cove with a 6-foot sea, 10-foot seas closer to Kodiak Island. By Sunday, conditions haven't changed much here. We have westerlies on the Bering Sea coast and inside of Bristol Bay with a 6-foot sea, 25 to 30 knots there on the Pacific coast with a 6 to 8-foot sea on Sunday. As we look in the Aleutians, winds are coming up in the west from the south at 25 knots with an 11-foot sea. You can see the switch over taking shape here west of Adak and then back into a north and westerly flow thanks to high pressure slowly dropping southward. 15 to 20 knots there in the central and eastern chain with 5 to 8-foot seas in the south and 4 to 6-foot seas in the Bering Sea coast. The winds become a little more south and westerly with time on Sunday with southerly flow still cranking up out in the west to 35 knots with an 11-foot sea. The west coast has a pretty much due westerly flow coming ashore, 15 to 25 knots, 6-foot seas in the Kuskokwim Bay. St. Matthew Island waters looking at 8-foot seas and westerlies for the Pribilofs with a 20-knot wind and a 6-foot sea. Southwesterlies shape up for Sunday, 25 knots in most areas north of Nunivak Island and St. Matthew Island. Southwesterlies for St. Paul and St. George with a 6-foot sea on a 20-knot wind there for Sunday. And the north slopes looking at easterlies, 15 to 25 knots, 4-foot seas there in the open water. Northeasterlies coming down the Chukchi Sea coast to Cape Lisburne and Point Hope at 15 knots. That becomes more of an offshore wind on Sunday, up to 15 knots with a 3 to 4-foot sea. And northeasterlies from Prudhoe Bay westward to Point Barrow at 20 knots. Westerlies will rule the day in Kaktovik with a 4-foot sea there in the open water on Sunday. Recapping tonight's weather, low pressure in the Gulf is deepening tonight, and there's an opportunity for thunderstorms to remain in place across the northern and eastern parts of the Gulf as a frontal boundary moves quickly towards southeastern Alaska. So rain will begin tonight if it hasn't already. Look for periods of moderate to heavy rain through the weekend as the wave of low pressure moves ashore. The center of low pressure will stay out over the open water and is reinforced by an upper level storm, and that will keep the focus for moderate to heavy rainfall and gusty winds from 30 to 45 miles per hour possible across central and northern parts of southeast. So the risk of mudslides is still possible there, as well as gusty winds and flooding. So pay attention to your local National Weather Service office in Juneau for the very latest information there. For the interior, showers continue, a chance for a shower or storm around Fort Yukon, and drier weather for South Central. Enjoy.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.